Waterfront Arts District, and I've been with Fred Allen for the last 29 years.
And I'm that Fred Allen. I was thinking about it tonight, and it was 34 years ago that I ran across this character, Patrick Stewart, who wanted to do a one-person Christmas carol. And I thought it was going to be a one-weekend vanity show like I'd done many times before with individuals. And then every year, it just got better and better and better. 2 years out, we went to New York. Nobody in New York believed that we could sell a ticket. We sold 110% of the box office. They don't count standing in room in the regular box office. Then, 92, we went back again. 93, we went to England. We played to the Old Vic and won an Olivier Award.
So this was originally conceived as a one-man show, and we're very grateful to Renee O'Connor and Jacob Nye, because they took apart the script that Patrick did as a one-man show and made two narrators and separated all the other parts. So without further ado, we want to bring the actors on, and please enjoy A Christmas Carol.
Marley was dead. To begin with, there is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Ebenezer Scrooge signed it. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and Marley were partners for, I don't know how many years. Though Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, there it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. But he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, made his eyes red and his thin lips blue. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and he didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas.
Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, all of the good days of the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge was busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open so that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, Bob Cratchit, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed.
A Merry Christmas, Uncle.
It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, Fred, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, and his eyes sparkled.
A Merry Christmas and God save you, Uncle.
Bah! Humbug! Merry Christmas. What a world of fools. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself another year older and not an hour richer. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. You keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it? But you don't keep it. Come dine with us tomorrow.
Oh, I'll see you damned first. Good afternoon.
But why? I want nothing from you. I ask none of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
And a happy new year.
Good afternoon.
His nephew left the room, but stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
There's another fellow, my clerk, Cratchit, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and a family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood in Scrooge's office with their hats off and books and paper in their hands.
Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night.
We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it's more likely than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of comfort, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?
They are still. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor then?
Both very busy, sir.
I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their usual course. I'm very glad to hear it.
Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing.
Oh, you wish to be anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I support the establishments that I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those that are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather die.
Well, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself. And the fog and the darkness thickened. The cold became intense, piercing, searching, biting cold. A young boy, whose nose was gnawed by the hungry cold, as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol.
God bless ye, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay. Remember...
Scrooge seized the ruler with such an energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
You want all day tomorrow, I suppose?
If quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I stopped you half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. But you don't think me ill-used to pay a day's wages for no work?
It is only once a year.
It's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day be here all the earlier the next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and buttoning his great coat to the chin, Scrooge walked out. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down a slide on Cornhill, at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to his family in Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner, Jacob Marley. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a house over a wine merchant's cellars. The house was up a yard where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses and have forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge.
Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little as what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, and that he had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cell. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected the sight of Marley's pigtails sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he closed it with a bang.
The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candles as he went, for it was pretty dark. But Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he looked in his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, nobody. Nobody in the closet. Nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus, secured against surprise, he lit a small fire in the grate, took off his great coat and cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, and on each smooth tile there was a copy of old Marley's head.
Humbug.
Scrooge's glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the lowest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw the bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound. Glang, 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 glang. But soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house.
Clang, 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 clang.
This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. He heard the cellar door fly open with a booming sound, and then the noise, much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
Oh, it's humbug still. I won't believe it.
His color changed, though, when without a pause it came on through the heavy door. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." The same faced, the very same Marley, in his pigtail, waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge had observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound around its head and chin.
How now? What do you want with me?
Much.
Marley's voice, no doubt about it.
Who are you?
Asked me who I was.
Who were you then?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Then do it.
Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it.
You don't believe in me.
I don't.
But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast.
Do you believe in me or not?
I do. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned into happiness.
You are fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?
Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
Jacob, oh Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. Comfort comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house, never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and never knew that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I. Business. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. At this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tonight when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. And the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over?
Look to see me no more. Look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us.
When it had said these words, the specter took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when its jaws were brought together by the bandage. His supernatural visitor rose and with its chain wound over and about its arm, walked backwards from him, and every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the specter reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear. For on the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings, sorrowful and self-accusatory. The specter, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window.
The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into the mist or the mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked as he had locked it with his own hands. Then, being from the emotion he had undergone or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed and fell asleep upon the instant.
Ding, 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 dong. Ding, dong. Ding, dong. Gadoing.
Gadoing, 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 gadoing.
12? It was past 2 when I went to bed. Why, it isn't possible that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. And it isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon.
Scrooge thought and thought and thought it over and over and over, and he could make nothing of it. Then he remembered, on a sudden, Marley's ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past. It was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length, it broke upon his listening ear.
Ding dong, ding dong.
1:15.
Ding dong, ding dong.
1:30. A quarter to it.
Ding dong, ding dong.
The hour itself and nothing more.
Gadoing.
Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge found himself face to face with a child. Yet not so like a child as like an old man. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. It wore a tunic of the purest white and held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, but in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its tunic trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light by which all of this was visible, and which was doubtless the reason for its carrying a great extinguisher, which it now held under its arm.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past.
Spirit, put on your cap. Be covered.
What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? It is not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow.
Oh, what business brings you here?
Your welfare.
Oh, well, I'm much obliged, but a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end.
Your reclamation, then. Take heed.
It put out its strong hand and clasped him gently by the arm.
Walk with me.
It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. They passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven. I was a boy here.
You recollect the way?
No, remember it. I could walk it blindfold.
Strange to have forgotten it for so many years.
They walked along the road. Scrooge recognized every gate and post and tree until a little market town appeared in the distance. Some ponies were now seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts, driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted, "Merry Christmas!" to each other as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes. Scrooge knew and named them, every one.
These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us. But their school is not quite deserted. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still.
They left the high road by a well-remembered lane and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes. Entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold and vast. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly barrenness in this place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge himself sat down upon a form and looked upon his poor, forgotten self as he had used to be. Not an echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed water spout in the yard behind. Not a sigh among the leafless boughs of the one despondent poplar. Not the idle swinging of the empty storehouse door. No, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge.
I wish...
What is the matter?
Nothing. Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to give him something, that's all.
Let us see another Christmas.
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Suddenly, Scrooge glanced anxiously toward the door. It opened to reveal a little girl, much younger than the boy.
Dear brother, I've come to bring you home. To bring you home. Home. Oh, home for good and all. Home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to me. That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if he might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man. Oh, and are never to come back here again. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world.
And in her childish eagerness, she dragged him through the door.
Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered. But she had a large heart.
Yes, so she had. I'll not gainsay it, Spirit, God forbid.
She died a woman and had, as I think, children.
One child?
True. Your nephew, Fred.
Yes.
They left the school behind them and were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time again, but it was evening and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door.
Do you know this place?
Know it! I was apprenticed here.
They went in. A corpulent old gentleman in a Welsh wig was sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling.
Why, it's old Fezziwig! It's Fezziwig alive again!
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7.
Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!
Scrooge's former self, now grown to a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice.
Yo-ho, my boys, no more work tonight. It's Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson.
You wouldn't believe how those 2 fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em. 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses.
Hilly-ho! Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here.
The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright as a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with music stand. He set it up and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkmaid. In came the boy from over the way who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In all they came, anyhow and everyhow.
There were dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddlers struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pairs of partners. But if they had had twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every direction of the dance like moons. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them. Scrooge's former self turned down the lamps, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air.
A small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. You spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. 3 or 4, perhaps.
It isn't that. It isn't that, Spirit. He had the power to...
What is the matter?
Nothing particular.
My time is short. Look.
Again, Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion that had taken root and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in whose eyes there were tears.
This matters little to you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
A golden one.
Ha, that is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth.
You fear the world too much. All your hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?
What then? Even if I've grown so much wiser, what then? I'm not changed towards you, am I?
Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy.
Tell me, would you seek me out and try and win me now? Today, tomorrow, yesterday, can I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? No, you are changed. I release you. With a full heart of love for him that you once were. You may have pain in this, a very, very brief time, but you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy with the life you have chosen.
And so she left him.
Spirit! Spirit, show me no more. Show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?
Scrooge turned upon the ghost and saw that it looked upon him with a face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him.
Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
Observing that the spirit's light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap and pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it so that the extinguisher covered its whole form, but though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light.
Scrooge had no need to be told that the bell was once again upon the stroke of one. But finding that, he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this next specter would draw back. He put them every one aside with his own hands and established a sharp lookout round his bed. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing. The bell struck one, ga-doing, and no shape appeared. But he sat upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour and made him apprehensive that he might become, at that moment, an interesting case of spontaneous combustion. But the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence it seemed to shine so. He went in.
It was his own room. There was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with living green. Crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long links of sausage, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door.
Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me.
The ghost was clothed in one simple green robe, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face and sparkling eye, its open hand, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air.
You have never seen the like of me before? Have never walked forth with my elder brothers, born in earlier years?
I don't think I have. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?
1,800.
A tremendous family to provide for.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. All vanished instantly. The room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. The steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes with their gayest faces. Scrooge and the ghost went on into the suburbs of the town, straight to the house of Scrooge's clerk. Mrs. Cratchit, Bob Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap, and make a goodly show for sixpence, was laying the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, into his mouth. And now, the two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked out loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled.
Whatever has got your precious father and your brother Tiny Tim then? And Martha want us late last Christmas Day by half an hour past.
Oh, here's Martha, Mother. Oh, there's such a goose, Martha.
Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are. Well, never mind, as long as you are. Come, sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless you.
No, here comes Father. Quick, Martha, hide.
So, Martha hid herself in the closet, and in came little Bob, the father, with his threadbare clothes darned and brushed, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame.
Why, where's our Martha?
Not coming.
Not coming upon Christmas Day.
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, even if it were only in joke. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits bore Tiny Tim off into the wash house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
And how did Tim behave, Bob?
As good as gold and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself and so much and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in the church because he was a cripple and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. He's growing strong and hearty.
Tim's crutch was heard upon the floor, and back he came before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to the stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon. And in truth, it was something very like it in the house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last, the dishes were set on, and grace was said.
For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen.
This was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and cried, "Hurrah!" There was never such a goose. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough. And the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to be witnessed, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in the turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were making merry with the goose, a supposition which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horror was supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. Oh, a smell like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quarters of ignited brandy and bedight with Christmas holly stuck in the top.
Oh, a wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Miss Cratchit since their first marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, in which Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks.
A Merry Christmas to us all. God bless us.
God bless us, everyone.
Tiny Tim sat very close to his father's side, upon his stool, and Bob held his withered little hand in his.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. None other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Man, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant, until you have discovered what surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions of these poor man's child.
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke and cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily upon hearing his own name.
Mr. Scrooge. I'll give you, Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed. Oh, I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he had a good appetite for it.
Dear, the children, Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you. Poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
Well, I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's, not for his. A long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness to it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care tuppence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. But after it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. The chestnuts in the jug went round, and by they had a song from Tiny Tim.
Underneath the gaslight's glitter stands a little fragile girl, heedless of the night wind's bitter, while the snowflakes round her whirl. There are many sad and weary in this pleasant world of ours. Still she cries to all who pass her, won't you buy my pretty flowers?
There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. Out in the street, it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily.
But the ghost and Scrooge saw much. Far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The Spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the Spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubt about this because the Christmas holiday appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left a children's 12th night party, when looking at the Spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that his hair was gray.
Are spirits' lives so short?
My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight at midnight. Hark, my time is drawing near.
The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at the moment.
Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?
It might be a claw, for flesh is there upon it. Look here.
From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garments.
Oh man, look here, look down here.
They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled them out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of old age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread.
Spirit, are they yours?
They are man's. Beware them both in all their degree, but most of all, beware the boy. For on his brow I see written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. The boy is ignorance, the girl, want. Deny it, slander those who tell it ye, admit it for your factitious purpose, and make it worse, and abide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource?
Have they no prisons? Have they no workhouses?
The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for a ghost and saw it not. But as the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and turning his head, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him, slowly, gravely, silently. The very air through which this spirit moved seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded.
I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand.
You are about to show me the shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, Spirit?
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It filled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him.
Lead on. Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, Spirit.
They scarcely seemed to enter the city, but there they were, in the heart of it, among the merchants who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets and looked at their watches and conversed in groups and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them so often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk.
No, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead.
Oh, when did he die?
Last night, I believe.
Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die.
God knows.
What has he done with his money?
I haven't heard. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know.
It's likely to be a cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?
I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, but I must be fed if I make one. Goodbye.
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 Good morning.
Good morning.
Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation, but the phantom pointed towards two other persons meeting.
How are you?
How are you?
Well, old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?
So I'm told. Cold, isn't it?
Yeah, seasonable for Christmas time.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach such importance to conversations apparently so trivial. Nevertheless, he looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of the day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that thronged in through the porch. But they left this busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized the situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offenses of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets. The whole quarter reeked of crime and filth and misery.
Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were brought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, and weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. Seated among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove made of old bricks, was an old, gray-haired rascal, Old Joe, nearly 70 years of age, who smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was followed closely by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other.
Let the charwoman alone be the first, let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone be the third. You couldn't have met in a better place. Come into the parlor.
The charwoman threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on the stool, looking with a bold defiance at the other two.
What odds, then, huh? What odds, Mrs. Dilber? If every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these?
Not a dead man. If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death. Instead of lying gasping out his last here alone by himself, open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it.
But the man in faded black first produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. But they were examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give to each upon the wall, and added them up in a total when he found there was nothing more to come. Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner.
And now undo my bundle, Joe.
Having unfastened a great many knots, he dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do you call this? Bed curtains? You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all?
Don't drop
with him lying there?
Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now.
His blankets?
Who else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say.
Ugh, I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?
Don't you be afraid of that. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did. You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it. Not a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me.
What do you call wasting of it?
Well, putting it on him to be buried in, but I took it off again.
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat, grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with detestation and disgust, which could have hardly been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. And Scrooge turned to leave.
He almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, beneath a ragged sheet, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of a man. A cat was tearing the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in this room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not care to think. The phantom's steady hand was pointed to the sheet. It was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face.
I understand you, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. Spirit, tell me if there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death.
The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and, withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness. But then the long-expected footsteps was heard, and the door was opened by a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight which he struggled to repress.
Wife?
Is it good or bad?
Bad?
We are quite ruined.
No, there is hope yet.
If he relents, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened.
He is past relenting. He's dead.
She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it. And she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart.
To whom will our debt be transferred?
Well, I don't know. But before that time, we shall be ready with the money. We may sleep tonight with quiet hearts, Caroline.
Soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. It was a happier house for this man's death.
Spirit, let me see some tenderness connected with the death, or that dark chamber which we left just now will be forever present to me.
The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, until at last they entered Scrooge's Clark's house and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were quiet. The mother laid her work on the table.
The color hurts my eyes. It makes them weak by candlelight. And I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time. But I think he's walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings.
They were quiet again.
I've known him to walk... I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there's your father at the door.
His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most.
You went today then, Robert?
Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that we would walk there on a Sunday. A little child. A little child.
He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. He left them and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the body of the child. Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the child's face. He was reconciled to what had happened and went downstairs again. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew,
Whom I had scarcely seen but once, and who meeting me in the street today, and seeing that I looked a little down, inquired what had happened to distress me, on which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, and heartily sorry for your good wife. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall not, none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us.
Never, Father.
And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves.
No.
Forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it.
Never, Father.
I'm very happy. I am very happy.
And the scene faded.
Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead.
The ghost of Christmas yet to come made no reply, but conveyed Scrooge as before until they reached a churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. The churchyard was walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one.
Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Men's courses will determine certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
The spirit was immovable as ever, and Scrooge looked down to read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name. Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I that man who lay upon the bed?
The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No, spirit, oh no, spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Good spirit, assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will live in the past, present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strike within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may wash away the writing on this stone.
And he seized the spirit's garment, and there began an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The room was his own. The bed curtains were his own.
They are not torn down. They are not torn down. Rings and all, they are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will.
Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. The father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. He ran to the window, opened it, and put his head out. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring, cold. Cold, piping for the blood to dance on. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet, fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious. He looked down and saw a boy in Sunday clothes.
What's today? What's today, my fine fellow?
Today? It's Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Well, of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow.
Hello.
Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner?
I should hope I did.
Oh, what an intelligent boy. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there, the big one?
What, the one as big as me?
What a delightful boy. Really, it's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck.
It's hanging there now.
Is it? Well, go buy it in my name, Mr. Scrooge, and tell them to bring it here that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in 5 minutes. I'll give you half a crown.
The boy was off like a shot.
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. You'll never guess who sent it.
Scrooge went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye.
I shall love it as long as I live. I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello. Whoop.
It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped him off in a minute like sticks of sealing wax.
Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy were only exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again and chuckled till he cried. At length, he dressed himself and got out into the streets.
The people were, this time, pouring forth as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked irresistibly pleasant, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said it often afterwards, that of all the sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. But he had not gone far, when coming on towards him, he beheld one of the portly gentlemen who had walked into his counting house the day before. It sent a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met. But he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it.
My dear sir, how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge?
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness?
Lord bless me, my dear Mr. Scrooge. Are you serious?
If you please, not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?
My dear sir, I don't know what to say. Such.
No.
I mean, this.
Don't say anything, please. Come and see me. Will you come and see me?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. I'm much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you.
And Scrooge found himself at the door of a church, and he went inside, and for the first time as a man, he joined his voice to those of his fellow creatures in a Christmas hymn. And Scrooge walked about the streets and watched people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head, and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up to the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything could give him so much happiness.
And in the afternoon, he turned his steps toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it. The door was answered by a maid.
Is your master at home, my dear?
He's in the dining room, sir, along with his mistress. I'll show you upstairs.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. He knows me. I'll go in, my dear.
He sidled his face in round the door.
Fred, it's I. Yes. Your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in?
Let him in.
It is a mercy he didn't shake his arms off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity. But he was early at the office the next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9, no Bob. A quarter past. No, Bob. He was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time.
Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. Suddenly he was there. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello? What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?
I am very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please.
It is only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, therefore, I am about to raise your salary.
Bob began to tremble and got a little nearer the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket.
A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I will raise your salary, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. You make up the fires, and before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit, you go out and buy another coal scuttle.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the old good world. Some people laughed to see this alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as to have the malady in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite good enough for him.
It was always said of Scrooge that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.